We just concluded the study in the book of James, which is an incredible piece of work to look at to begin with. And Peter runs pretty much hand in glove with what James has to say. James has got a lot of things to say relative to our conduct in life, general principles of how we're to maintain ourselves. And he was writing that, if you recall the first chapter, writing that book and sending it to those who were of the dispersion, those who he felt that could use this information. And it was sent. Peter's information, Peter's book, 1st and 2nd Peter, is going to be similar, except it's going to be more directed in a specific area of the country. And we'll get into that in a little bit. But both books are similar in what they have in the principles and the things that they're trying to teach. And Peter's trying to get that across to us. Both of these books were, I thought, interestingly enough, were written, and there's no way to know the exact dates, but probably both books were written in between 62 and 69 AD. Now what that means is that the latter part of that time frame is just ahead of when Jerusalem's going to be destroyed, which means Rome is on the rampage. Okay? Rome is on the rampage, persecuting Christians, persecuting the church, persecuting a lot of things from a governmental point of view. If you recall, when we studied the book of Acts, a lot of the things that was going on in that relative to persecutions there was within the Jewish nation itself. Conflicts between those who believed in the Old Testament and the New Testament and the implementation of all of this, belief in Jesus, just some fundamental things was going on there. Rome's getting in the picture here. And when Rome gets in the picture, it gets ugly. And it gets ugly quick, particularly around AD 70. A lot of people are killed because of Nero and what he does. And if you want to read an account of that, there's a Jewish historian by the name of Josephus. He's got an incredible amount of stuff to say about it, and if you got stomach enough to read it, okay, because I'm telling you, it's ugly. And that's what Rome did. So Peter is encouraging these folks in light of that, in light of what's coming, okay, to help to take courage, to understand that it's coming. You know, persecution is going to come, and when it does, here's what you need to hold on to. Now, we can look at this from one of two ways. We can look at this and read this and say, okay, yeah, this is okay. I can get by this. Or we can put ourselves in those people's spot. Think about it for the minute as we're sitting here right now. Okay? We go out that door to go home, not realizing if we'll be back here again. Because of Rome. Because of your belief in the Lord. Because of your being a Christian, you may not get back here tonight. That's what Peter brings to this. Okay? Now what he brings to this is saying, okay, in light of that, here's what you need to hold on to. And here's what you need to be, and be determined that however this comes down, you're going to win. As long as you remain faithful to the Lord, you're going to win. Does that mean it could get real ugly? You better believe it. And it did for a lot of folks. And Peter's saying, in light of that, get yourself ready. And here's what's going to happen. So it's a book to encourage Christians, both Jews and Gentiles, okay, to remain faithful to the Lord no matter what. And like I said, we can read that and we can say, well, yeah, that's not a problem. We live here in 2018 and we don't have that problem. But I can assure you, if it was in AD 68 or 69, particularly in 70, we'd all be sweating bullets.
They can get that way quick.
It certainly can. That's what I'm saying. We don't know how good we got it.
Right.
We don't appreciate how good we've got it. And it could change, like you said. Hopefully not. But it could. Okay? So that's where we're going with this a little bit this morning. But by way of introduction and looking at things here a little bit, I want to take a look at some background of Simon Peter. as we get into the study this morning. I found this incredibly interesting when I started doing some reading about it. On the very initial introduction of Peter and the Lord, in John chapter 1, verses 40 to 42, it says, "And one of the two who heard John speak followed him was Andrew and John, Simon Peter's brother. And he found his own brother Simon and said to him, 'We have found the Messiah,' which is translated means Christ. And he brought him to Jesus." And watch this. He brought him to Jesus. And Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon the son of Jonah or John. You shall be called Cephas," which is translated Peter or rock. The initial meeting of what takes place here sets the stage. Okay? The Lord looked at Peter not about what he was, but about what he could become. He looks at you and me the same way. Not about what we are, but about what we can become. Now we know the story of Peter, a lot of intricate details about him. And in all the ups and all the downs, the Lord knew that. And he knew what the end result would be with this man and what he would finally do. Now, if you don't think it had an impact on Peter, history has it when Peter was crucified finally and killed, he was crucified on a cross upside down. Okay? His choice, he told him what to do because he didn't want to die the same way the Lord did. He didn't feel he was even that good. And that's the route he chose. Peter had more grit, even the ups and downs of all of that, than anybody you want to read about. Paul and him were just right there. Right there. If you recall in the book of Acts, when we studied that, about the first 10 chapters or so of the book of Acts, deals a lot with Peter. He had a lot to do with the beginning of the church, with the beginning early sermons that were presented, and so forth. Peter was a valuable tool, and then after the conversion of Cornelius, then the inference of the book then shifts from Peter more to Paul as he continues that. But Peter had a tremendous amount to do with the beginnings, and we'll talk about a little bit more about that in just a moment. I thought this was an interesting thought for you. Peter was married. You believe that? All right. Two ways. First of all, let me share with you in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 15, which I didn't catch before until I put this together. My defense, and Paul's speaking here in 1 Corinthians, talking about defending his apostleship and so forth. But in that conversation, he says, "My defense to those who examine me is this: do we not have the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, even as the rest of the apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas?" Specifically named, Peter had a wife. Now, to further indicate that, in Matthew chapter 8, verse 14 through 16, and this is a situation where Jesus is involved in coming to Peter's house. When Peter came to Peter's home, when Jesus came to Peter's home, he saw that his mother-in-law laying sick in the bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she got up and waited on him. If he had a mother-in-law, guess what? He had a wife. So you kind of put two and two together, and it works. Okay, so he's quite a figure. He's got a balance about him that we can all understand. I mean, he was a working man. Okay, he was an apostle of the Lord, no question. But he was also a married man, family man. And he's also an elder in the church. How do we know that? 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 1 indicates that that he was married and so forth. But he talks about in 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 1, addressing the elders, who am also an elder, and he uses that phrase. So he's got that in his background. On top of everything, you would think being an apostle would be enough. You know, I get that, but trust me, if you've been in an elder's position, you got more headaches than you can believe you knew how to deal with. Okay?
1 Corinthians 9:15 reads different.
What's it say?
But I have used none of these things, nor have I written these things, that I should be done so to me, for it would be better for me to die than that anyone should make my boasting void.
Okay, hold on a second. It's entirely possible I wrote it down wrong.
It's verse 4, there's what you got. You do got 15. Do we not have the right to
There you go. You're right.
drink? Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife?
There you go. Thank you.
It's just verse 4. He just put 15 there, but if you look down under, he's got verse 4.
It's a test. You passed. You passed. Thank you. I'll get that fixed. Sorry about that. Okay. But that gives us some more information about him, correct information about him, and thank you for that. Okay, so as we take a look at now more about Peter, all right, we come also to this idea that he lived in Capernaum, and I'll have a map here in a minute to show you that. He lived in Capernaum. He's born, I think the first verse says, in Bethsaida. If I remember, yeah, no, I read it. Anyway, he's originally born in some of the background, I think. I picked, it's here in the book, in the second paragraph, Simon, native of Bethsaida. But he lived in Capernaum, Mark chapter 1, verse 21. Both these cities are on the Sea of Galilee, and I'll have a map here in a minute to show you that. But in Mark 1, it talks about they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath day, he entered into the synagogue and began to teach. This is Jesus accompanied by the apostles then at the time. And then down a few verses in verse 29, he says that immediately after they came out of the synagogue, they came to the house of Simon and Andrew and James and John. I only put this up here to show you that this is where his residence was. This is where he lived. This is where his house was. And so that's part of the information we see about him, where he resided. We also know, too, in his background, and I said a minute ago, he's a working man. He's a fisherman. Okay, and again, please understand the makeup of this and what the verses, they show us, and if you run by it, you miss it. Okay, watch this. In Luke chapter 5 and verse 10, it says, And James and John, son of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon, and Jesus said to Simon, Do not fear, for now you will be catching men. And when they had brought their boats to land, they left everything and followed him. The interesting phrase is the last one. Now, he's a businessman. He's in partnership with James and John. They've been fishing. You guys know all about this. When they come into land, they meet the Lord. They left their boat, left the gear, left everything there, and followed the Lord. Is that special or what? It's incredibly special, especially when we look at Mark chapter 10 and verse 28, where Peter says, when he's talking with the Lord, and Peter began to say to him, Behold, we've left everything to follow you. That's the magnitude of that decision. And I keep coming full circle back to me, and I say, would I do that?
He's a married man, got a family probably. I mean, it's like he's maybe toying with that for just a second, but he knows the right thing to do.
Yeah. But could we put ourselves in that spot in 2018 and do the same thing? How many bills you got, how many cars you own, how many houses, it just goes on and on. And all of that gets in the way. Peter comes in with the boat and the gear, leaves it, and follows the Lord. That's the important part of the makeup of Peter. Now, his ups and downs, we'll talk about that, no question, okay? But his commitment, his desire to be committed, that type of thing, goes without question. Goes without question what he wants to do.
Hey, Roger, I'd like to make
Sure.
just one statement about this. Now, we talk about him being a married man. We don't know exactly what point in life where he become a married man.
Right.
Now, when Jesus called him, and in this situation, this is the beginning of Jesus' ministry, so he's going to live at least 67 more years if the date of this book is right.
Right.
So he could have been a single man at this time and did this, and then later on in years, married. I mean, that's just,
All that is absolutely true, and in either case,
yeah,
a tremendous decision has to be made.
right.
Am I going to put my family through this? If I'm single, am I going to put myself through this? I mean, you see how we would rationalize this. We would look at pros and cons and like this, and it's like Peter says, I'm going to leave my boat here and I'm going to follow you. The decision was made. It's just a neat concept, a neat side of him that we just don't sit back and look at very often. But the man was there. I mean, he had Jesus back.
Sometimes we have to forsake even more than that.
Yep.
Even our family. Christ
Yep.
told us-
And I've known of it.
Christ has told us that, those that has to forsake mother, father, whoever, has what?
Yep.
Has more to gain.
Yep. And I can guarantee you, just in the case that we're talking, those decisions aren't easy. Those decisions aren't easy. I mean, you can have it in your mind to do it, but there's that emotional side of you that tugs and says, it's hard. It's not easy.
Well, it's evident how many people have fallen away from the church because they had to make a decision which turned them in the wrong one.
Yep. Or they made the commitment initially and went back. Or, things along that line. You're absolutely right. Absolutely right. Good thought. Now,
Was Zebedee apostle? Was he one of the, he was one of the apostles?
Zebedee was the son of John.
Yeah, he was.
I mean, the father.
the father, yeah.
He was in charge.
Yeah, he's the
Boat,
father.
in the boat there, so he
Right.
got stayed with the boat and kept the boat.
Could have been. But verses talk about particularly he's in fishing business with James and John. Dad could have been involved. No question, it could have been.
Yeah.
But at least at this point, that's what he decides to make the commitment to and go. And that's what,
He made mention that he sacrificed all.
yeah.
So he didn't turn away from it.
Yep. Now, another interesting little sidelight about Peter, okay? There we go. All right. Peter was part of the inner, and I'll call it the inner circle of Jesus' disciples, along with James and John. And by that I mean there's three basic disciples that seem to be on a closer relationship with the Lord than the others. Okay? And here's why I mean that. Only these three, Peter, James, and John, were present at the time Jairus' daughter was raised from the dead. They were the only three he hid with him there to do that. Secondly, they were the only ones present when Jesus was transfigured on the mountain in Matthew chapter 17, verses 1 and 2. They were the only three that were up there. In the Garden of Gethsemane, again, just there by themselves. And so it's interesting, he's part of that group that seemed to be a little closer to the Lord than the others. Also, on the Mount of Transfiguration, and that's talked about in Matthew chapter 17, verses 1 and 2. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, his brother, and led them up on a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone as the sun, and his garments became as white as light. We have a hard time visualizing that account because of because of the description. We kind of can't really picture it well. But let me tell you, it left an impact on Peter. The transfiguration we just read about was later commented by Peter in 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 17 and 18. It says, "For when he received honor and glory from God the Father, such as an utterance as was made to him by the majestic glory, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. And we ourselves heard this utterance made from heaven, and for we were with him on that holy mountain." How could it not have been impactful as to what they saw and what they heard? There's no wonder that his commitment to what finally would be his strength was seen here. He saw it firsthand. He witnessed it firsthand, and that's what he did. Now, I told you I had some maps I wanted to share with you. This is a map. Bethsaida is right here. That's where he's originally from, and Capernaum's right there. The Sea of Galilee is right there on the north and the northwest. It makes sense that would be where they would be relative to fishermen, because that's thank you. That was convenient for them, or that would be a location for them for that. Okay. Now let's take a look in just a minute at the opening verse of chapter 1, because I want to show you something here relative to this. "Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who reside as aliens scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, Bithynia, who are chosen." We'll talk about the verse specifics in a minute. But for the minute, I want you to see what that verse is illustrating, okay? Because as he makes mention of all these places, all right, Pontus is here, Galatia here, Cappadocia here. He then goes to Asia, and then on up to Bithynia. Is there any part about this that you've seen before, that we've studied about before? In fact, some of it in pretty good detail. What about the churches of Asia, to begin with? Ephesus is there. We studied a lot about that in the book of Acts, when Paul's there for 3 years and the persecution that takes place. And of course, those 7 churches are listed in Revelation as the 7 churches of Asia that John writes to later on. Okay? But look at Galatia. How many churches do we know in Galatia?
I know of one.
This is a test. Go back and think. How many did we study about in Acts? This many. 4. Antioch of Pisidia, Lystra, Iconium, and Derbe. Now you would think, okay, Paul made 3 journeys through Galatia. He stopped by these congregations on all 3 trips. You would think that Peter wouldn't have to give the detail here that he's going to in these 2 books. But Peter wants these folks to know, because they're not that far from Rome, and let me show you. Jerusalem's here. This entire region that he's talking to is right here in that circle. Rome is just over here in Italy. They're not that far away from really feeling the wrath of Rome, and Peter doesn't want to leave them out either. And so he writes this letter, and it's conveyed also to them as well. So these regions of the country are all part of what he's going to deal with and talk to those folks who are residing there. Now, to give you a ballpark idea, Jerusalem to someplace in the mid-range of the big circle, it's probably about 500 miles away. So it's not around the corner. It's not around the corner. To get this message to that kind of a group of people would take a courier. It would take someone to be taking it to them, explaining things to them, and so forth in a letter form. And so it would be incredibly important for that to all happen in a concise way so that everybody can, take advantage of what Peter has to say. Now, as he opens this book, of course, we understand that Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, we understand that to those who reside as aliens. Okay, what does that start to tell us? First of all, question 1 on page 47 says, how did Peter identify himself? And he calls himself, I already told you, an apostle. Okay, what did that mean? Okay, servant. What else?
He was an ambassador, one sent with a message.
Okay, all right, one sent. One sent as an ambassador, as we'll see over here in another question or so. And so he's representing, he is a chosen one, and he's going to bring this message to them. In Acts chapter 1 and verse 8, what are they called?
Witnesses.
Okay. What was the qualification? Let me go back. I love this. We already talked about this way back in Acts chapter 1. I know you just remember this. What was the qualifications to be an apostle?
They had to see Jesus
Didn't see Christ.
From when to when?
from his walk.
From the beginning to the resurrection and his ascension.
Okay. That all wraps into what you're thinking? Okay. What'd you have, Belvis?
I had come across something I never did realize, because I just thought the apostles was the 12 apostles, but I discovered that Barnabas was an apostle. It's an Acts.
Well, to be
Eh.
an apostle,
Called
you
an
had to
apostle.
see Christ, didn't you?
Yes.
Had to
Yes,
be
you're right.
able to see.
Yes. You got to watch how the terminology is used. Okay, it can mean apostles like in the 12. It can also be a general statement meaning to be like one or close, an ambassador like one, and certainly he was. But as far as the 12 are concerned, we have 12, 13 if you count Paul, which you have to. And then the comment about what you're saying certainly includes him in that role, but not officially, not named. But you're right, it's there. Go ahead.
When they use that terminology for Paul, as I said, the word can mean one sent forth.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, when you look at what happened there in Acts, they had sent forth Paul and Barnabas.
Right.
That's where I think the terminology of the apostle here comes in.
Well,
Is that the church had sent him out as a messenger for them, and the terminology is used apostle.
right.
But
Right.
to get to the apostles which writ the Bible, had wrote the Bible, then you see that they were the ones, just like when they was going to choose Matthias,
Mm-hmm.
they said, all right, we have to have someone who has been there, who has witnessed everything that we have witnessed.
And there was only 2.
There's only the 2, and the lot fell from Matthias.
Right.
So Barnabas, yes, is called that, but it's in a different
It's in a different
meaning of
sense.
the word.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
So that is-
Yep. All right. On the next page, question B, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 20, and we've already talked about this. They are called ambassadors, representatives and so forth. Now, he gets into a little different thought here and works this in question C. He says, questions about the revelation of truth. And then he says, what part of truth was made known unto them? And he refers to John chapter 16 verse 13.
All true.
All truth. What makes that different than the old truth?
It's all true.
I know, but what makes the difference?
Well, the old truth is nailed to the cross. The new truth is now.
Was the old truth complete?
No.
And there's your difference. The old truth wasn't, it was truth, but it was truth to a point till the Lord came. Okay? And then after that, it fulfills that, and the new truth, the rest of the truth, I guess put that way, the rest of the truth is then put in place. But he illustrates that. Who revealed the truth to them?
Jesus.
God
right? God by his Spirit, 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 10. In those words did they speak, in whose words did they speak this truth? Okay, all right, yes. Yes, Paul was among the number who became an apostle later. How did he receive the truth? And this is the question I was referring to a minute ago. How did he receive that truth?
Through the revelation of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, and he makes it very clear. He makes it incredibly clear that he didn't get this from man. He did not receive this from man. And Jesus reveals this to him. Thought being, when you take a look at his conversion in Acts 9, that as he's in Arabia for the 3 years, that's when, it would make sense that this would have occurred after his conversion while he's beginning his work in Damascus, and that revelation would have occurred at that time. It would have made sense that could have happened. We don't have a absolute, but you just have to kind of think about it being that way. But Paul then, no question about his apostleship, and he has to defend that quite often in his writings, and does. And so he illustrates that and brings that to their attention in what he has to say. All right. The question then in 5, is it possible for us to know the truth?
Yes.
Yes.
How?
Through the New Testament?
Okay. Is there anything miraculous about it?
Yes.
How?
Just knowing it, but the word itself is miraculously.
The word is, no question. But our knowing it relies on what?
Now, Paul tells a young preacher, Timothy, study to show thyself approved. That's not miraculous.
No.
That's study.
That's study. That's effort. That's putting the work into understanding what it has to say and doing something with it. Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, now let's talk about the apostles just a minute. Questions about them. Are there men today, and he wants to share this with us in this writing, are there men today who are eyewitnesses of Christ?
No.
If there is, they're about 2,018 years old, huh?
That's right.
And that isn't going to happen. All right. No, there's not that. Okay, are there men today who are ambassadors of Christ?
No.
Yeah.
Yes.
Be careful. Be careful.
That's a trick question.
It is. And I wrote down yes, no, because I know what he's driving at. He's saying, is there people based on the preceding question? And the answer is no. But the other idea in terms of what the term ambassador means, yes, it certainly is. So we go with that. So yes, no is a good answer. You go with that, Beth? All right.
I put yes with a question mark. For
Yeah.
the reason of what you said.
Sure. Yeah. I just wrote down yes, no, then I wasn't wrong. Then I wasn't wrong. Okay, number 3. Are there men today to whom the Spirit is revealing truth?
Yes, no.
No.
That's exactly. I said the same thing again. No, from the standpoint of there's no miraculous, there are no apostles that said, but yes, from the standpoint of us being knowledgeable, becoming aware of what the word is, and applying it and using it. Absolutely. So yes, no is another good answer for that one. All right. Are there apostles of Christ living among us? No, we got that. All right, we're good. All right. Now, let's talk about the ones that are talked about here who are residing. That gets us to question 2 here. To whom was the letter addressed?
To the scattered elect.
Okay. To who again? Strangers. Okay, strangers. Okay. Any other words you have there for it? Aliens. Okay. All right. The New American Standard, I think, kind of helps us understand it a little clearer. An apostle of Jesus Christ to those who reside as aliens. Okay? What does that term tell us?
Non-denominations or
Okay? What else does it say?
They were out of their home country,
Okay? Residing as
foreigners.
foreigner, visitors.
Yes.
Okay? And that's the idea that Peter wants these folks and us to understand where he's going with this. He knows their situation. Now the question then becomes, let me see. Okay, yeah. Question A. All right. Why were they scattered?
Persecution.
Go back to the study of Acts. If you recall, when I kept beating this drum, because there's a lot of things that we read about in the rest of the New Testament that has its beginning.
Because of their own beliefs.
Not so much, but because of the persecution that took place in Acts chapter 8, when they went everywhere. Okay, because of Saul, and because of what was going on in chapter 9. Okay, all of that takes place and starts right there, and that's why the dispersion is there. Although this happened several years ahead of time, many years before this, there's still things that happened in Judea that caused this initial movement of people then. What are these people called?
Christians.
Elect.
Okay. After the country of Asia and Bithynia, is that where the word elect comes in for you guys?
Yeah.
Okay.
Verse 2.
Okay. American Standard calls that who are chosen. Okay. The idea of that idea. Now we get into this a little bit. The elect in question A, another word for the elect. I already answered that. Who are chosen? Who had chosen them?
God.
Boy, this is going to be a can of worms. All right. Now, really?
Through obedience.
All right. That's what I want us to get nailed down here. They had a choice. Okay? They had a choice to believe it or not, like we do today. Correct? But if you want to go after this and say, well, the God predestined all this, really? You see what I mean? That when you read the verse that way, you could come away with it that way. But that's not what Peter's driving at all. These folks had a choice, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, by the sanctifying work of the Spirit, that you may obey Jesus Christ and be sprinkled with His blood. May the grace and peace be yours to the fullest measure. And I want to talk about that in a minute for just a few minutes of time we have left. But they chose to follow the Lord like we all choose to follow the Lord. And that's what Peter's reminding. This isn't a situation where it wasn't something that God said, oh, I got to do this because this happened. God planned this from the get-go. It was in His design, His plan for all of this to take place. Question C, the election was according to what?
Foreknowledge.
Foreknowledge of God. His plan, the thoughtfulness of what He had put together for His creation. Go ahead, Bill.
Well, and I just want to add to what you're saying here, when it says, according to the foreknowledge of God. Well, we know that before the foundation of this world the gospel was already in God's mind, in God's plan. Then when you look at Galatians 4, and verse 4, I believe, there it says, when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth His Son. So what God chose to do was to send forth His Son at the right time, that these people could be obedient to Him. And like John says, to those who believe gave He power to become sons of God.
Right.
So that's the ideal here. God's foreknowledge of the gospel of His Son being brought to the forefront at the proper time, that He would die and that He would be resurrected, that these people would have this call or this chosen or this election under that system.
Right. Right.
But it has to do, as Belva said, through obedience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And of course, James stressed that all the way through. We talked about that. You had to have them both. And of course, this is going to go here. Go ahead, Mark.
I want to bring something to before it goes any further, before I forget.
Okay, I'll take that one better.
Christ told Peter at one point, he said, when you're fully converted, feed my sheep, right?
Right.
So it wasn't dumped on him, like he didn't have no choice. We could see within that he had a choice to make up. He had to make up his mind.
And I think, I said a minute ago about Jesus knowing what Peter was going to become. I mean, why would you or how would you make a statement about somebody being a rock and based on your belief in Matthew 16, based on this, I'm going to build my church. I'm going to base this on me, and you're going to be the one that's going to spearhead all of this. He had a tremendous amount of faith in what he was going to be able to do.
A lot of people confuse what God can do opposed to what he does.
Yeah,
He don't force people, he just knows pretty much what they're going to do.
exactly. Now that can be changed.
It can.
It can be, but it's up to us. God's got the plan.
The Lord pretty much gave Peter the choice. He said, it's not like a definite, I'm making you do this,
One of the most phenomenal chapters to me in the gospel is John 21, because that's where the Lord meets Peter after the resurrection and reclaims Peter, if you will, after he had denied the Lord, gone through the whole situation with that, and felt horrible about what the Lord told him that it's what was going to happen, and he did it anyway, and he felt bad about it. John 21 is the recovering, the recouping of Peter, and getting him squared away, getting his head screwed back on right, and getting to the job that he had to do out there. And not once, and I find this just so incredible, not once did the Lord say, see, I told you were going to do that. I told you it was going to mess up. Never even talked about. Never even discussed. Not even anything about that is brought up in John 21. The Lord wants to build this man and put him on the track that he needs to be on. And he does. In Acts 2, he hits the ground running. And it's neat. It's a great story. John 21's a good one. Go ahead.
Back today, it stays on track then, don't it?
Yeah, he does. He does.
Well, he gets off a little bit and got.
Well, yeah, Paul's got to slap him around a minute, but he's okay. He's got to fix him, but he does. But do you have something?
I was just saying the Lord is on one track concerning within righteousness that we be saved.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what he's focused on.
Right.
He's not focused on gouging us or anything that would cause us to stumble or fall. He is concentrating totally and solely on us being in heaven with him.
Yep, absolutely. That was his plan. That was his purpose. That's why he came. He's done his part. It's up to us now to do our part to take advantage of what he's provided. What he's provided. All right. Well, let's mark question D on page 49. Mark will pick that up Wednesday evening, and he and I are sharing the class. I'm doing Sunday morning, and he's doing Wednesday night. And this is going to be a good thing, I think. So we'll pick up with question D on page 49 for Wednesday evening. Again, appreciate your guys' comment. You teach a good class. I appreciate it. Thank you.